Good afternoon, and once again, welcome. It is Sunday, May 23rd, and I am grateful to be with you and to study another portion of God's Word this afternoon. Again, I do want to welcome everybody, and as we are continuing to engage in our studies from home, and let's go ahead and get started with the lesson that I have prepared for this afternoon or this evening, whenever you are watching this particular study. I want you to turn your Bibles at this time to the book of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, where we are going to begin in just a few moments in chapter 5 and in verse number 8, and we will go through the end of the chapter. For those who are not regular attendees at Rose Avenue, over the course of the past couple of years, we've devoted one Sunday night a month to studying through the book of Ecclesiastes. And of course, in this particular book, what we find here is Solomon is setting out to establish what is the meaning of life. And in the first 2 or 3 chapters of that book, he actually goes into details of various things that he tried to find happiness with and concluded that all things in this world are vanity. But after he finished that, throughout the remainder of this book, he goes into details about various aspects of life in a way that's similar to the Proverbs, but it's more organized. And we find that there's a vanity associated with worldly pursuits of every different type. And there's a need to consider God as we live in this empty world. And when we understand these things, it is something that can help us to see the real meaning of life. And so this morning, or this afternoon for a few moments, what we are going to do is we are going to be studying from a text in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, as I've already said, and in verse number 8, and going through the end of the chapter. And this is a text where Solomon is dealing with the vanity of wealth, or what I might say, things concerning prosperity. So let's go ahead and read this text, and then we will go from there. Again, Ecclesiastes 5, beginning in verse 8. We read, "If you see the oppression of the poor, and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept from their owner to his hurt, but those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? All his days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him. For it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart." So we find in this particular text that Paul, or Solomon, is going to deal with 3 different subjects. He's going to first of all talk about rulers, and then after he talks about rulers, he's going to talk about those who desire to be rich, And finally, he's going to talk about the satisfaction of those who are content with what they have and that which is a blessing from God. So let's go ahead and get started with these various things by talking about rulers that he deals with in verses 8 and 9 of this particular text. One of the things that I want us to understand when we talk about government, we need to understand that government is needed. We may not like the way a particular government acts, but understand that what would this world be like if there was not a government? What would our nation be like if we didn't have governing authorities? Well, you would have complete chaos. Everyone would do whatever is right in their own eyes. So we need that. We need governments to protect us. Sometimes protection needs to be larger than what you can do for yourself personally. We need government to administer justice and to deal with criminal aspects and so on. And the Bible actually is very clear about that. If you turn over to Romans chapter 13, you will find in that text that Paul says that we are to be subject to the governing authorities. And he goes on, there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. He is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. And he goes on and says you need to be subject, you need to pay your taxes, and you need to do various things that you ought to do. And that's not the only New Testament text that tells us these things. Over in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17, Peter encourages the same thing where brethren are concerned. He makes the point that you submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. So we can see that we are to show honor to the governing authorities. We need government. It's one of those things, whether you like it or not, and whether you like the way a government is, we still need governments in place. It was ordained by God. Now, going back to our text, though, we find Solomon makes an observation where he says, if you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. Don't be surprised that all rulers are not honorable. In fact, it is sad that many world governments, and I fear to say most world governments are worldly. And when I say worldly, what I mean is they do not really care about God. They don't care about what God's will is, and they don't care about whether or not you have the freedom to worship the God or to worship God the way that you are taught within Scriptures. They are driven by worldly and often very selfish pursuits. And that's what Solomon is observing in this text. But of course, he makes some observations about that. He first of all he says, "Do not marvel when you see the poor or other subjects oppressed by quote unquote high officials." And in using that description, they're not just the king, but the governors that he appoints, or the mayors of a particular city, or you could even make application to this economically. Those who are in powerful positions economically, even though they may not be in a governmental office and so on. It is not uncommon for those who are in positions of power to take advantage of the poor or those who are under them, or to use them as pawns to get what they want, or to neglect them because of their selfish pursuits. That is just the reality of this world, and we shouldn't marvel at that. And we shouldn't marvel when governing authorities are willing to pervert and deny justice, to change the rules of justice that exist even within a government, and pervert righteousness because it's of a selfish benefit to them. How often do we see that in leaders? And sometimes leaders get caught and they go to prison because they've done things that are just outright illegal. But other times they just twist the rules to their benefit, regardless of who it harms in the process. And here's my question. We happen to live in a country where we are able to vote. And that really is a blessing. And I asked, are we responsible for putting ungodly individuals in positions of leadership? And I say that, who do you vote for when you vote? Do you think about who God would be most pleased with as you make that decision? And if you choose to vote for those who are ungodly, those who may help you with your selfish and material pursuits, should you be surprised when they don't care about God and His will? Or when they don't care about you and your faith? Or when they choose to deny you the freedom to worship God the way that He wants you to worship Him, because it's not self-serving where they are concerned? Who do we blame when we elect such people and put them in place in this particular country? Now, one of the observations that Solomon makes, and this is a source of consolation even if we have an ungodly government, and remember that as Paul wrote to the Romans and as Peter wrote in the first century, the government there was hostile to the Christian faith. So it very much applied. And here Solomon tells us in our text in Ecclesiastes 5 that high official watches over high officials. And the point there is that most people, even in positions of authority, they have to answer to somebody else. There are very, very few people who do not have some governing body or somebody to whom they have to give an accounting for at some point in their lives. And in addition to that, you've got the idea that they have to answer to someone for themselves, and even those over whom they rule, they need to at least appear like they care for you. And it's kind of tragic that when you get into a political year and into a political season, how every politician will tell you how much they care about you, but their actions often speak louder than their words. And it doesn't matter what political affiliation we are talking about there. But there's the realization that there's an accountability. And so take consolation in that when evil leaders govern selfishly. History shows that the more arrogant and powerful somebody is, the harder they fall when they finally do fall. And isn't that what we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 12? Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. But we can also take this even a step further when it says high official watches over high official and higher officials are over them. I want you to think that the highest of all officials is God Himself. So don't forget that. It doesn't matter what a ruler does in this world, how wicked and corrupt they are, how selfishly they act. They're going to one day give an accounting to God for the decisions that they have made, just like every one of us will do. And but then Solomon also observes that the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. And this is one of the points to consider when you talk about rulers, especially those who are ungodly. The New American Standard reads, after all, a king who cultivates a field is an advantage to the land. And the point Solomon is making there is even evil kings, even evil rulers, provide some general good as a rule to the people. They see to it that the people are provided for with what they need. And they provide general protection from those who are evildoers and those who set out to harm you as such. And so you've got that idea of the profit of the land is for all. And a wise ruler realizes that he needs his subjects. He needs those who are under him to sustain him. They're dependent on the land, and they're dependent on the people to provide for them. In Ecclesiastes 6, verses 1 and 2, we read that there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. Realize that there's nothing in this life that is guaranteed. And no matter how powerful somebody gets, it can be taken from them. And again, the more you have and the higher up you are, when you fall, the harder the fall is. So that's the ruling or the warning that is given by Solomon in dealing with rulers. And we may be frustrated with the decisions of our government, but I want you to understand that God is in control. God is watching. So your responsibility as a Christian, where the government is concerned, is to just continue to serve God and continue to do the best that you can where your rulers are concerned. And remember what we are told in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, where Paul challenged Timothy to pray for all men and to pray for those in positions of authority and for our rulers, and pray for them that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life. And I contend that's something that we need to do now in the circumstances that we are dealing with right now. So that's Paul's or Solomon's concerns with rulers, his observations concerning that. The next point that he deals with has to do with wealth, has to do with prosperity. And it's interesting, in verses 10 through 17, there are 6 or 7 different things that are mentioned here that show the folly of making wealth your main pursuit in life. And I'm going to list 6 of those that we find in this particular passage. So let's go ahead and get started with that. The first one I want to note is that he who is driven by wealth often sees that it is never enough. Again, you will notice in verse number 10 of this text, it says, "He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity." How often do we find those who are greedy and those who are driven to pursue wealth, that no matter how much they get, they're not satisfied? They always want a little bit more. It's just a little more than what they have right now, and then they will be satisfied. But when they achieve that, all of a sudden, they want even more. Paul warned Timothy, and I want us to go ahead and read this text in 1 Timothy chapter 6. I want us to read this because we're going to keep coming back to this text. So let's go ahead and just read it now, and then we will go from there. 1 Timothy chapter 6, and beginning in verse number 6, we read there, "Now godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, from which some, having strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." There are so many points that Paul makes in this text to Timothy, where he is encouraging him. And remember the point that he begins with there: godliness with contentment is great gain. Well, Solomon's warning was, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with it. He who loves abundance, he who is driven after the pursuit of abundance, will not be satisfied with the increase that he has. So that's the first point that we would give consideration to. Those who are driven by wealth, it's never enough. You're never going to be satisfied if money is your pursuit in this life. But another interesting observation is when goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? And this is an interesting statement where Solomon is observing those who have a lot of goods. Isn't it amazing how people come out of the woodworks and they want to be your friend? You know, as long as you're giving stuff away and as long as you have great abundance, they want to be there with you, and they're going to help you consume it, and they're going to help you use whatever that wealth is that you have. But I ask, how many are only there because of the wealth? In the New Testament, Jesus gives the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Luke 15 verses 13 through 16, and this is in the midst of that parable where the prodigal son has demanded his inheritance, and for whatever reason his father gives it to him. And then it says that he leaves and goes to a far country and he spends it on prodigal or wasteful living, depending on the text that you read there. And I suspect, even though it's not specifically mentioned in the text, that he probably had a lot of friends that were ready to help him spend what he has. And there's a reason why I say that. Because we read, as you go on, that all of a sudden there's a great famine in the land, and he joins himself to a pig farmer, and he's feeding the slop to the pigs and so on, and it says there in the text, no one gave him anything. How sad it is. Very likely he had all kinds of friends when he was giving it away, but when it was all gone, so were his friends. And so here he is in a pigsty. He can't sink any deeper, and he's all alone by himself. Jesus over in John 6, this is after he feeds the 5,000, as John records it, with just a very, very small child's meal, a happy meal. And he's able to feed this huge crowd. And the next day, they come to find him again. And Jesus says, the only reason you're trying to follow me is because you want another meal. You're following me for the possessions, for the things that you can get out of me. And after some strong preaching, we read in John 6 and verse 66 that after he said these things, many of his disciples walked with him no more. And we find here an occasion where Jesus is actually discouraged, at least a little bit discouraged and disappointed at the response of those who are supposed to be his disciples. When all of a sudden the possessions go away and the things that they want, they leave. How tragic that is. And that's the observation that Solomon is making when he says when goods increase, they increase who eat them. I want us to always understand that money may buy you companionship. Money may buy you company, but it will never buy you a true friend. And so keep that in mind when you give consideration to prosperity. And there's another thought here when it talks about when goods increase, they increase who eat them. Another thought about increase is as good increase, there's increases in other areas that you might think about. The more you have, the greater your responsibility is. The more you have that you need to manage. And the greater your possessions and those who are around you, the more expense there is. And the more expense you have to support your lifestyle. How many individuals who are wealthy have created such extravagant lives that that they have to continue to develop more and more wealth just to maintain the lifestyle that they have created for themselves. You know, I think of Solomon, who is described as having 700 wives and 300 concubines, and there's passages in the text that describe how much food he had to provide on a daily basis. And it was a huge amount. That's a large responsibility. Often that comes with increased goods as we increase our lifestyle in the process. But also with that, you have greater worries and concerns where your resources are. And in addition to that, oftentimes there's a greater debt associated with that. You know, I've often found it interesting how lenders are more willing to lend to those who already have more. The less you have, the less likely lenders are to loan you something, even if you prove yourself to be honorable. Even if you prove yourself to be somebody who is honest and you've paid your debts and so on, if you're poor, it's going to be more difficult to get somebody to lend to you, even though you might have a genuine need. And the Bible has so much to say about debt and getting into debt as a result of these things. In Proverbs 22 and verse 7, Solomon said, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender." May we never forget that as we live our lives. In Romans 13 and in verse 8, Paul there said, "You know, owe no man anything except to love one another." I do not believe in that text that Paul is saying it's wrong to take out a loan, but he's saying you pay your debts. And you don't need to get yourself into so much debt where you become a slave to other individuals. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And the lender is willing, he's willing to lend to you so that you will owe him, and so that he will own you or own a part of you. Something for us to think about. Another observation that Solomon made in our text concerns sleepless nights. In verse number 12, we read there, "The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep." So Solomon makes two observations here. First, he says the sleep of a laboring man is sweet. There is something to be said about one who has enough, and he's satisfied with his life. He has with integrity worked, and everything that he has gained in an honest way. He lives a humble life, and he works hard for what he has. And at night, when he is ready to go to bed, he's had a productive day and he sleeps. He's able to sleep, and he's able to sleep comfortably, resting well, because he knows he's done the best that he could, and he has not wasted the day or the resources that he has. That's the laboring man, the average man, sometimes the poor man, from that as you're making the contrast in this text. But then Solomon goes on and says, "But the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep." And I think of someone who has worked long hours and sacrifices just so that he could get a little more. Maybe he's lost his family, or he hasn't given himself any time to enjoy what he has, because he's spending so much time getting just a little bit more. And so he loses sleep that way. He'll trade sleep just to get a little more money. And then there's the idea of what we've already talked about, worry, where his possessions are concerned, and his investments and so on. He's worried about what's going to happen to those things. He's concerned about how to keep them and how to maintain them and how to protect them so that he doesn't lose them. And say for some reason his investments begin to fail, and he has sleepless nights because he's losing that which he has put his trust in. You know, and I just ask, are we seeing some of that right now? as over the course of the things that have happened over the past few months, as we've seen our economy plummet, how many people have lost massive percentages of that which they have invested? And how many lose sleep every night because of that? Because that's all that they have depended on is their wealth and so on. The abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. But something else we find with wealth is the uncertainty that comes with riches. We continue to read in verses 13 and 14 of our text. It says, "There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches kept for their owners to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand." Solomon here describes what he calls as a severe evil, and another way of saying that may be something that is a great misery. Riches kept from their owner to his own hurt. And the New American Standard gives us a little bit of understanding of what he's talking about here. This is talking about someone who has possessions and he keeps his own possessions. The New American Standard uses the word hoarded. Riches being hoarded and so on. There's not many things that are more tragic than hoarding. And really, hoarding is a selfish, and I might add to that, because of its selfishness, it is very likely a sinful act. Over the course of the past couple of decades, there have been shows on television that deal with hoarding, and they show the damage that is done by those who they just have possessions and they just won't let go of them. And you go into their homes and you find that they're so filled with clutter to the point that there's barely a path to get through the living room and to get to one's bed and so on. And often those places are filled with filth and garbage and all different types of things. And as they start trying to clean those things up, you have the mental anguish of the individuals because they don't want to let go of anything whatsoever. But you also find that many of their valuable possessions are ruined. They've been destroyed because they've been neglected. That's just one of the things that can happen when people are caught up in hoarding. And quite often those who live such lifestyles, there's the realization that those things, they're not a guarantee that you're always going to have them. Many lose those things over time. You cannot control what happens in the end. You cannot stop disasters. You cannot stop diseases from changing what is going on. And there's the mental concerns that sometimes drive individuals crazy to the point where they are declared incapable. And thus they've lost control of their possessions. And then, of course, there's death itself. All of those are things to think about. Riches kept from their owner to his hurt. One of the things that Paul told Timothy over in 1 Timothy 6 and in verse 17 is he said there, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy." Paul says, don't trust in the uncertainty of riches. Riches will let you down. But there's another observation that Solomon makes in our text, and that is found over in verses 15 and 16, where Solomon talks about you can't take it with you. You read on, "As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. And he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind?" So Solomon makes the observation that for those who are rich, you need to realize that you cannot take it with you. He makes the point that he came from his mother's womb, and the observation that is made there is when you're born into this world, you're born naked. All you have is yourself. And you're very, very much dependent on others to sustain you. And when you die from a material possession standpoint, you're going to return to the earth just as naked as you were when you came into this world. The point is we come into this world with nothing. We come into this world with nothing material except for our flesh. And when we leave, when we die, we're not going to take anything materially with us. And Paul actually made that point as we read a few moments ago in 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 and 7. And the observation, we brought nothing into this world, we can take nothing out. I've often jokingly made the observation, you never see a hearse going to a cemetery with a U-Haul attached to it, with that individual's possessions. They mean absolutely nothing when this life is over. There are those who, when they look at this life and the pursuit of things, they might say something to the effect of, he who dies with the most toys wins. It's a disturbing statement. I'll tell you what I say when I hear that. What has he won? Doesn't matter how many toys you have. What have you really won? The way that I say it is, he who dies with the most toys is still dead. You cannot take it with you. And Solomon makes another interesting observation in this text about this. He goes on and says, he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. He's describing the types of things that you cannot carry away. We need to understand when we die, there are things from this world that we will take with us. But it's just not our money. It's not our home. It's not our possession. It's not our clothing and our jewelry and those types of things. The only thing that we're going to take with us is the way that we live. What we're going to take with us is the spiritual decisions that we have made in this life. You read over in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and in verse number 10 that we shall all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. We're all going to appear before God in judgment. You may remember that Jesus himself said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, and beginning in verse 19, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. What's the point? You can't take it with you. He says, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. And that's the point that we need to give consideration to. We need to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. That means we need to prepare for eternity. We need to live our lives with good attitudes and godliness. We need to ensure that we are ready to stand before God in judgment, and that we are saved, and that when we stand before him, he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. That's what our desire needs to be. Because you cannot take anything in this world with you. The final observation that Solomon makes, and this is found in verse number 17 of our text, we read, all his days he eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Oftentimes, wealth and prosperity brings about misery in one's life. We must understand that wealth is no guarantee of happiness. It's not even a guarantee of good health. How many people that we know that have been materially successful, whether it be in the entertainment world, whether it be in the business world, whether it be in the political world, they've been extremely successful and they've gained all sorts of wealth as a result of that. But yet they're not happy. They have to go to the psychologist and they have to go to the psychiatrist to help them with their mental struggles because they cannot find happiness in their possessions. That's because God's right and they're not. And furthermore, wealth It's not going to cure somebody that's a bitter person. It's not going to cure somebody who has an angry disposition. The only thing that are going to take care of those things is to change your mind, is to change the way that you approach life, to learn to be content and to resolve that your attitude is going to be what God wants it to be. Wealth, it can increase sorrows in your life, and we've talked about some of the reasons why this is the case. Wealth can lead somebody to a very dark place if they let it rule them. Remember how Paul said there in 1 Timothy 6 and in verse number 10 that the love of money, and I want you to note he did not say there that money is the root of all evil. He said the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And he talks about in that text with which some have strayed from God, and they've pierced themselves through with many sorrows. They're living sorrowful lives because they have made possessions their goal in life. And there's disappointments because they haven't got what they want in many instances. And when they do get what they think they want, they realize that it's not enough and it's not everything that they want. How sad that is. And then that brings us to the final 3 verses of this text where Solomon leads us in a different direction. And let's go ahead and read this again, where Solomon says, "Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is a gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart." Solomon is saying here, enjoy what you have. It's your heritage. It's a gift from God. Here Solomon has all these negative and dangerous things to say about wealth, and Jesus did the same thing. But understand that there's nothing wrong with wealth itself. There's nothing wrong with enjoying life and living with prosperity that you have received in an honorable and a righteous way. And there are many in this world who want you to feel guilty because you've been successful. God doesn't want you to feel guilty, provided you're living the way that you ought to. One of the things I know that I've emphasized throughout the book of Ecclesiastes and at other times is that money is morally neutral. Wealth is morally neutral. You read in the scriptures of plenty of wealthy individuals that were godly men and women. They loved God and they managed their resources in a way that God was pleased with them. It's not how much you have, it's the way that you manage it. And that's really what it's about. Now, we need to understand that with wealth, if you are blessed with wealth, and in the United States of America, we really are a wealthy nation, and we ought to appreciate how much we have. But understand that if you've shown compassion and generosity to the poor, God's something that God expects us to do. If you have been honest in your dealings and in what you have received, you've done it in an honorable way. If you have been content, and if you are content, and if you're humble, and if you're thankful for what you have, and if you have not made possessions your idols, enjoy what you have. It's just that simple. God wants you to enjoy what you have. And that's the point that Solomon is making here. It's good to enjoy what you have. Just don't make the pursuit of stuff your goal in life, because that becomes emptiness. Solomon concludes there in verse number 20 by just saying, keep busy doing the good things. And in doing that, don't dwell on the past. Don't dwell unduly on the days of your life. Don't look at, oh, poor pitiful me, if I'd have made this decision, how much more would I have right now than what I have? Don't dwell on your failures. Just be grateful where you are at and keep doing good. I'm reminded of the parable of the rich fool in Luke 18. This is where a man has prospered greatly and he has so much resources that he doesn't have enough room to store. And he says, this is what I'll do. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And then I'm going to sit back and just enjoy life, eat, drink, and be merry. But God came to him that night and said, you fool, this night your life will be required of you. Then what will these things mean for you? And the point that Jesus is making there is so is he who is rich with this world's good, and he doesn't lay up anything for God. Don't forget God. And don't forget to keep doing that which is good and that which is right. Paul told the Galatians, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. And I realize he's talking primarily spiritual there, but he's saying don't give up. Do good. Remember to thank God for all that you have. And that was Solomon's point in this text that we are dealing with. Prosperity. Where is your trust? Is it in the things of this world, or is it in God? I ask you at this time, if you would, to please bow with me in prayer. Our dear God and our Heavenly Father, as we come to you at this time, we are truly grateful that you have so abundantly blessed us in this life. We realize that we are prosperous, and even though we are dealing with difficult and uncertain times, we know that compared to so many others, we are blessed in so many ways. Help us with whatever resources we have to use them in such a way that you will be glorified in our life. And help us to not love money and make that the pursuit of our life. Help us to realize the folly and emptiness of making our pursuits the things of this world. Be with us as we go through the remainder of this day and as we go through the remainder of this week. And if it be your will, bring us back together. Allow us to gather together as quickly as possible. All of these things we ask through your Son's name, and amen. And again, I want to thank you for listening to this lesson this afternoon. I bid you to give consideration to these things, and may God bless you as you go on through your day and the remainder of this week and the remainder of your life. And if nothing else changes until next week, hang in there, and God bless.